Imagine you're at a dinner party. Everyone agrees to chip in for pizza. But when the bill comes, half the table starts looking at their shoes, pretending they forgot their wallets. You end up paying more, but they still get to eat. That, in a nutshell, has been NATO's problem for 75 years. It's called free riding, enjoying the benefits of security without paying your fair share for it. And it's been baked into the alliance since day one. During the Cold War, it was tolerable because the Soviet threat kept everyone somewhat motivated. After the Soviet collapse, Europe's defense budgets plummeted while the US kept spending big. By the 2000s, Washington was shelling out more than double the NATO average, while politely asking its allies to do better. Polite didn't work. Even the 2014 pledge to spend 2% of GDP on defense mostly sat ignored until February 2022. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine flipped the table. Suddenly, NATO planners weren't talking about meeting benchmarks. They were asking, how do we stop a Russian tank column from rolling into Warsaw, Tallinn, or Bucharest in the first place? The answer they landed on is bold, and for NATO, unprecedented: spend 5% of GDP on defense. That's not just troops and tanks. Up to 1.5% can go into infrastructure, like railways that can move armor or ports that can handle supply ships. Sounds good on paper. But here's the catch. NATO can't force anyone to do it. There's no pay or get out clause, and if even a few countries decide to freeload, the whole deterrence strategy starts to wobble. So, how do you make 31 sovereign states with 31 domestic politics and 31 sets of excuses actually follow through on the most ambitious spending plan in alliance history? NATO thinks it has a plan, a mix of subtle persuasion, clever timing, economic sticks, and a dose of what one official calls ambiguous strategic ambiguity. Today we're unpacking exactly how that's supposed to work, and why the real enforcement tools are the ones NATO doesn't like to talk about out loud. For as long as NATO has existed, the alliance has had to grapple with one of the oldest problems in collective security: free riding. The term refers to a situation in which some members of a group benefit from the costly efforts of others without contributing their fair share. In the NATO context, it means that certain countries enjoy the security guarantees provided by the alliance, especially the deterrent power of the United States, while failing to invest proportionately in their own defense. This dynamic has frustrated policymakers for decades, not because it is unexpected, but because it is almost built into the DNA of the alliance. Historically, free riding was a manageable irritant during the Cold War. The existential threat posed by the Soviet Union made the stakes clear and immediate. Even then, however, the United States shouldered a disproportionate share of the military burden, maintaining a global network of forces, supplying advanced weapons systems, and underwriting much of NATO's deterrence capability. Western European states certainly spent heavily on defense in the Cold War's early decades, but as time went on, many found political incentives to divert resources to domestic priorities, confident that Washington's commitment would remain unwavering. When the Cold War ended in 1991 and the Soviet Union collapsed, the incentive to maintain high defense spending evaporated for much of Europe. Leaders and publics alike concluded that the peace dividend could be spent at home. Defense budgets shrank across the continent, military manpower was reduced, and large-scale weapons procurement slowed dramatically. For a while, this seemed a reasonable trade-off. After all, the immediate threat to European territory appeared to have vanished. But from the United States' perspective, this shift created a structural imbalance. Washington's military spending remained high due to its global obligations, while Europe's spending continued to decline. The problem worsened in the early 2000s. After the September 11th attacks, the U.S. sharply increased defense spending to fund operations in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other theaters. Many European allies supported these missions politically and in some cases militarily, but their budgetary commitments did not keep pace with Washington's surge. By the late 2000s, the United States was spending more than twice as much on defense as a percentage of GDP as most of its NATO partners. Successive U.S. administrations, Republican and Democrat alike, voiced frustration, warning that the imbalance threatened the alliance's long-term credibility. To address the issue, NATO set a guideline in 2006 recommending that each member spend at least 2% of GDP on defense. This was never a binding rule, but it was meant to be a benchmark, a shared understanding of what pulling one's weight looked like. Compliance, however, was spotty. Many allies paid lip service to the target without making concrete plans to reach it. It was only after Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 that momentum shifted somewhat. At the Wales summit that year, NATO leaders pledged to move towards 2% by 2024. Yet even this was a soft commitment, and as history would show, many countries delayed serious action until Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. That invasion was a shock to the system. It demolished the assumption that large-scale interstate war in Europe was a relic of the past. Suddenly, NATO faced not just the abstract risk of aggression, but an ongoing high-intensity conflict on its eastern flank. The alliance's planners began to calculate not only what it would take to defend every inch of NATO territory from a potential Russian attack, but also what would be required to deter Moscow from attempting such an attack in the first place. The numbers were sobering. Deterrence and defense in the current environment, they concluded, would require sustained and substantial investment, far beyond the old 2% threshold. That is the context for the most ambitious spending plan NATO has ever agreed upon, the 5% of GDP target announced at The Hague in June. This figure is not arbitrary. According to alliance war planners, 5% is the amount necessary to field and sustain the forces, munitions, infrastructure, and logistical networks required for both credible deterrence and effective defense. It reflects lessons learned from Ukraine about the pace of modern warfare, the scale of ammunition expenditure, and the need for resilience in industrial production. It also incorporates a broader understanding of what defense spending means, allowing for a portion up to 1.5 percentage points to be invested in dual-use infrastructure such as ports, rail networks, and cyber defense systems that would be critical in wartime. In principle, the 5% target should be a rallying point for the alliance. In practice, it raises all the familiar challenges. The commitment is enormous by historical standards. Even during the Cold War, many NATO members did not sustain such levels. Achieving it will require politically difficult trade-offs in domestic budgets, and the temptation to free ride, letting others make the sacrifices, will remain strong. Moreover, NATO has no formal mechanism to compel compliance. It cannot fine, suspend, or expel members who fall short. Its strength has always been rooted in consensus and shared purpose, not legal enforcement. That is why the question of how NATO plans to enforce the 5% target is so important. Without credible mechanisms to encourage compliance and discourage free riding, the target risks becoming another aspirational figure, worthy in principle, but eroded in practice. This sets the stage for examining the alliance's new enforcement toolkit, from political persuasion to more innovative, and in some cases, more coercive strategies. At its core, NATO's free riding problem is a textbook example of how collective goods are underprovided when there is no effective enforcement. Defense of the North Atlantic area is the ultimate collective good. It is non-rivalrous. One country's protection doesn't diminish another's, and non-excludable. If you are inside NATO, you can't realistically be excluded from the benefits of deterrence. Those properties create powerful incentives for some members to let others bear the cost. The logic is simple. If an ally spends heavily on defense, it strengthens NATO's overall military capability, but the benefits of that investment, deterring a Russian incursion, protecting airspace, securing sea lanes, are spread across all members. Any individual country only directly feels a fraction of the gain, but it must bear all of its own costs. If the cost to a government's budget and political capital is greater than the fraction of the benefits it internalizes, the rational choice, at least in narrow self-interest, might be to spend less, confident that others will cover the gap. This is why free riding is not about ignorance or bad faith. In fact, it is a perfectly rational behavior when judged through the lens of self-interest. The problem is that when many members act this way, the total level of investment falls below what is necessary for credible deterrence and defense. The alliance as a whole ends up weaker, which paradoxically makes every member less secure, even the free riders themselves. The problem is not theoretical. We can see it in the spending patterns of NATO members over decades. The United States has consistently spent well above the 2% guideline, often closer to 3.5 to 4% of GDP, while many European allies have hovered between 1% and 1.5%. During times of crisis, there is usually an uptick in allied spending, but the effect is often short-lived. Once the immediate threat recedes from headlines, budgets revert to lower levels. Importantly, NATO's free riding issue is not absolute. Most member states maintain some level of military capability for national purposes beyond NATO's collective missions. Small and medium-sized countries in particular often tailor their forces to local defense needs, disaster relief, or peacekeeping missions. These expenditures contribute to the alliance indirectly, but they are often insufficient in scale or scope to meet NATO's broader strategic requirements, especially when planning for high-intensity conflict with a peer adversary like Russia. There are also positive dynamics within the alliance that partially offset the free-riding tendency. Economists call these strategic complementarities. When one ally invests in a specific capability, it increases the value of complementary capabilities in other allies. For example, if Poland acquires advanced air defense systems, it becomes more valuable for Germany to invest in mobile armored units that can operate under that protective umbrella. These complementarities can motivate allies to spend more than they otherwise would because they see a clear mutual benefit. Another moderating factor is Russia's own strategy. Moscow has long sought to exploit divisions within NATO. One effective tactic would be to single out a specific underperforming ally for intimidation or coercion. The risk of becoming a visible weak link can create its own incentive to maintain at least baseline levels of defense spending. No country wants to be the obvious target that an adversary thinks it can pressure without triggering a unified NATO response. NATO's new 5% spending plan also contains a built-in incentive to win over domestic political constituencies that might otherwise resist higher defense budgets. Up to 1.5 percentage points of the total can be spent on infrastructure, rail lines, port upgrades, logistics hubs that have clear civilian as well as military utility. For lawmakers who are reluctant to pour money into purely military hardware, the dual-use clause provides political cover. They can frame the spending as an investment in national infrastructure and economic resilience. Still, even with these positive incentives, national defense needs, strategic complementarities, reputational concerns, and dual-use investments, there remains a persistent tendency toward underprovision. The structural logic of the free rider problem does not disappear. Every ally knows that if others are spending enough to keep NATO credible, there is a temptation to contribute less and enjoy the benefits without matching the costs. And if enough members think that way, the alliance's deterrence posture erodes. This is why NATO's leaders view the free riding problem as a collective action dilemma, akin to the prisoner's dilemma in game theory. In a one-off interaction, the rational move is to defect, to contribute less, because the benefits of cooperation are spread out while the costs are borne individually. But in repeated interactions, cooperation can be sustained if members adopt strategies that reward compliance and punish defection. In theory, NATO could adopt a tit-for-tat approach. If one country reduces its spending, others could reduce cooperation areas that benefit that country. In practice, this is much harder to implement in a 31-member alliance. The difficulty is compounded by NATO's size and design. Small alliances can sometimes rely on informal reciprocity, where each member's behavior is easy to monitor and respond to quickly. But NATO is large, diverse, and consensus-driven. Moreover, its founding treaty contains no mechanism to suspend or expel members for noncompliance. That design choice made sense in 1949 when unity against the Soviet Union was paramount, but it leaves today's alliance with fewer enforcement levers. The result is that NATO must rely on a mix of persuasion, peer pressure, political incentives, and creative workarounds to encourage compliance. The new 5% target has made the stakes higher than ever, but it has also magnified the enforcement challenge. Solving the free riding problem is not just about fairness. It's about ensuring that NATO's deterrence strategy is credible in the eyes of both its members and its adversaries. Without credible follow-through, the 5% figure risks becoming another aspirational goal that quietly erodes over time. When facing the free riding problem, one obvious tool in any political leader's kit is persuasion, appealing to allies' sense of responsibility, shared values, and collective danger. NATO has used this approach for decades, often with passionate speeches, carefully crafted communiques, and stark warnings about the consequences of underinvestment. But history shows that persuasion by itself is rarely enough to change entrenched spending behavior. Part of the issue is that NATO's members are not uninformed. Defense ministers, prime ministers, and parliaments are well aware of the alliance's strategic needs, the scale of the Russian threat, and the importance of credible deterrence. The problem is not one of missing information, it is one of competing political priorities. Defense budgets are expensive, and the benefits, though real, are diffuse and long-term. By contrast, domestic spending programs offer immediate, visible payoffs to voters. For many politicians, the political calculus is straightforward. The electoral rewards for cutting a ribbon on a new hospital or school are far more tangible than those for funding an armored brigade. This is why even powerful rhetorical appeals often fall flat. Secretary General Mark Rutte, for example, has warned in interviews that Russia produces 3 times as much ammunition in 3 months as the whole of NATO is doing in a year. In London, he quipped that countries unwilling to raise their defense spending should prepare to learn to speak Russian. Such statements grab headlines and may energize the already convinced, but they seldom shift the position of those who are skeptical or opposed. Where spending levels are concerned, most political camps have already made up their minds. The limits of persuasion are even clearer when we recall that free riding is in many ways a rational choice. If an ally believes it will be protected whether or not it meets the spending target, persuasion alone must work against the grain of self-interest. A well-informed leader can still conclude, accurately, that their country's marginal contribution to NATO's overall capability is small, while the budgetary and political costs are large. Appeals to fairness or shared responsibility do little to override that cold calculation. There is also the issue of diminishing returns. In the immediate aftermath of a crisis, such as Russia's invasion of Ukraine, persuasive appeals can have a strong effect because the threat feels urgent and undeniable. But as time passes and the political agenda shifts, that sense of urgency fades. Without concrete enforcement mechanisms or material incentives, the initial surge in spending can plateau or even reverse. Persuasion works best as a short-term motivator. It is much less effective at sustaining high levels of effort over many years. That is not to say persuasion is worthless. It plays a supporting role, especially in building the political and public consensus needed to pass budgets or approve new procurement programs. It can also help frame non-compliance as a reputational risk. No country wants to be publicly singled out as NATO's weak link, but on its own, persuasion cannot solve the underlying problem. The free rider dynamic operates in full view of the facts. It is a structural incentive problem, not a misunderstanding. For NATO's new 5% target, this means that speeches and headlines will not carry the day. They must be paired with mechanisms that alter the cost-benefit calculation, linking compliance to tangible rewards and non-compliance to tangible consequences. Without that, persuasion will remain just that, words on paper, impressive at the summit podium, but quickly forgotten when domestic budget negotiations begin. If persuasion is too weak a tool to guarantee compliance, the logical next step is to adjust the incentives. NATO's 5% GDP defense target isn't just a number, it's meant to be paired with mechanisms that make compliance more attractive and non-compliance more costly. One of the clearest ways to strengthen incentives is to emphasize each country's own defense needs beyond NATO. Even in the absence of collective commitments, every member faces individual security challenges, cyber attacks, espionage, hybrid warfare, and border pressure. By framing spending as an investment in national security rather than a contribution to a NATO pool, political leaders can make the target more defensible domestically. It shifts the argument from we're paying for others to we're making ourselves harder to attack. A second incentive is rooted in strategic complementarities, the way different allies' capabilities enhance each other. NATO's effectiveness relies on interoperability, compatible communication systems, standardized ammunition, and shared logistics networks. The value of one member's modern fighter jets increases if others have the refueling tankers to keep them in the air, or the surveillance assets to guide their missions. If a member underinvests, it not only weakens its own defense, but also erodes the value of investments made by others. Conversely, when multiple members upgrade together, the combined effect is larger than the sum of its parts. This network effect creates a natural incentive for states to keep pace with each other, provided they believe others will follow through. There's also the deterrence factor. NATO's doctrine assumes that Russia, or any potential adversary, pays close attention to alliance cohesion. If Moscow sees a consistent pattern of certain states lagging behind in defense investment, those states could be singled out for political pressure, cyber disruption, or even targeted military threats. In that sense, spending enough is not only about building capacity, it's about avoiding the appearance of weakness that might invite aggression. The 5% target also introduces a novel infrastructure spending clause, allowing up to 1.5% of GDP to go towards civilian projects with military utility. This could mean rail lines capable of moving heavy armor, deep-water ports for naval resupply, or robust energy grids that can function under cyber attack. By widening the definition of qualifying spending, NATO is trying to make compliance politically easier. Leaders can frame these projects as economic development, not just military buildup. But even with such incentives, there remains a structural reason why underspending persists. The prisoner's dilemma logic at the heart of NATO burden sharing. In the classic prisoner's dilemma, two suspects are given a choice: cooperate with each other by staying silent, or defect by confessing to the authorities for a lighter sentence. The paradox is that while mutual cooperation produces the best collective outcome, each individual has a strong incentive to defect, because if the other person cooperates, they can gain even more by defecting themselves. Applied to NATO, the cooperation is meeting the defense target. Defection is underspending while relying on others' deterrent power. The ideal collective outcome is when all members spend enough, creating overwhelming deterrence. But for each individual state, the temptation is to spend less and divert resources to domestic programs while still enjoying the security umbrella. This logic explains why under-provision of defense spending is not simply a political failure. It is the predictable outcome of rational cost-benefit calculations in a system without strong enforcement. NATO's challenge, then, is to alter the game so that the payoff for cooperating is greater and the cost of defecting is higher. In repeated interactions, like NATO summits held year after year, game theory suggests that tit-for-tat strategies can sustain cooperation. In tit-for-tat, a player starts by cooperating, then mirrors whatever the other player did last round. Applied to NATO, this could mean rewarding countries that meet the target with greater influence, joint exercises, or access to advanced technology, while reducing such benefits for laggards. The first challenge is coordination. A small alliance can more easily agree on priorities, set timelines, and monitor compliance. In NATO's early decades, most members shared similar threat perceptions. The Soviet Union was the singular adversary, and the defense burden was clearly defined. Today, the threat environment is more diverse. Russia remains the primary concern for Eastern members, but Southern allies often focus on instability in North Africa and the Middle East, while others prioritize cyber defense or Arctic security. This diversity of priorities makes collective goal setting more complicated and provides political cover for countries to argue that their preferred investments should count toward the target, even if they don't fit NATO's main operational needs. The second challenge is enforcement in a large club. In smaller groups, social pressure and reputational costs carry more weight because relationships are personal and visible. In a 31-member alliance, any single country's underperformance is diluted in the statistics. Moreover, political realities make it almost impossible to impose hard penalties on laggards. NATO cannot realistically suspend security guarantees without undermining its own deterrence credibility. Finally, size increases the temptation to free ride. In a big alliance, the marginal effect of one country's spending seems small. A government might reason that even if it cuts back, the combined force of the other 30 will still deter any threat. This is the classic public goods problem. The larger the group, the greater the individual temptation to rely on others' contributions. Alongside the size issue is what might be called the hockey stick problem in defense budgeting. It refers to the tendency for spending to spike suddenly in moments of crisis, then flatten or even decline once the immediate danger fades. We've seen this pattern repeatedly. After Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, European defense spending began to rise, but the increases were modest and uneven. It wasn't until the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 that many NATO members dramatically boosted budgets, creating a sharp upward curve in the spending graph, like the blade of a hockey stick shooting up from a long, flat shaft. Yet history warns that such spikes often prove temporary. As political attention drifts and fiscal pressures mount, the upward curve can plateau or even reverse. This is particularly risky for the new 5% GDP target. If the surge in spending is driven mainly by the urgency of the Ukraine war, then any perception of reduced threat, whether due to a ceasefire, frozen conflict, or simply war fatigue, could cause momentum to collapse. Defense investments, especially in infrastructure, take years to bear fruit. If funding is front-loaded during a crisis but not sustained, NATO risks ending up with half-completed projects, underfunded maintenance, and a capability gap just when adversaries are adapting. The hockey stick dynamic also interacts with domestic politics. Leaders often prefer to commit large sums quickly to signal resolve, but such spending can be politically vulnerable in later budget cycles. Successor governments may inherit costly commitments without the same sense of urgency, making defense an easy target for cuts when economic downturns or social spending pressures arise. To break both the size problem and the hockey stick trap, NATO needs to think beyond simple percentage targets. 3 approaches stand out. Number 1, institutionalizing commitments. Rather than leaving spending decisions entirely to annual national budgets, NATO could encourage members to lock in multi-year defense plans that survive election cycles. This would reduce the risk of abrupt reversals when governments change. Number 2, tailored accountability mechanisms. With a large alliance, uniform enforcement is difficult, but tailored mechanisms, such as regional capability benchmarks or targeted readiness goals, could make monitoring more precise and politically palatable. For example, Baltic states might be evaluated more on forward-deployed combat readiness, while Southern members could be assessed on maritime security contributions. Number 3, smoothing the curve. Instead of allowing spending to spike and crash, NATO could structure the 5% goal as a ratcheting target. Once a country reaches a higher percentage, it should not fall below that level without facing a formal review process. This would create a floor, preventing steep drops in investment. NATO's 5% GDP defense target is an ambitious, even provocative attempt to address a problem as old as the alliance itself. The free riding dynamic will not disappear simply because the number has been raised. It will only shift the battleground to new political debates, new accounting tactics, and new negotiations over what counts as defense spending. The reality is that persuasion will always have a role, but it cannot carry the weight alone. Incentives must be aligned so that national interest and alliance interest point in the same direction. Game theory tells us that without such alignment, cooperation will remain fragile, prone to collapse when crises fade or domestic politics intrude. The size of NATO magnifies both the benefits of collective defense and the difficulty of ensuring fair contributions, while the hockey stick pattern threatens to turn short-term surges into long-term disappointment. Ultimately, the success of the 5% target will depend less on the speeches made at summits than on the policies embedded in national budgets, and the quiet but critical work of sustaining political will over years, not months. In the end, deterrence is not built in a single burst of spending. It is maintained by steady, credible investment that convinces any adversary that NATO's umbrella will remain open, fully and evenly supported, no matter how stormy the weather becomes.